who is also a member of Parliament for Gaborone Bonington South, and also our Minister of Finance, Brendaba Nkosinati Haulath. Recognize the Minister for State President, Moeti Mohwasa. Recognize all our ministers in their eminence, together with their assistants, and thank them very much for not only being here now, but for the great work that they discharge for this republic. Let me greet and acknowledge, I haven't seen her really. Oh, I see her now. The Deputy Permanent Secretary to the President, Mebukoli, and state that she was actually my classmate at law school. Recognize the Attorney General, Marco Abraham. Recognize our Chief of Staff in the Office of the President, the radical economist, the disruptive thinker, Dr. Upa Tseko, who challenges and pushes you hard, wears his emotions on his sleeves. So at any point in time, you know and can tell what he is feeling and thinking. You don't have to guess. That's a very good thing. Recognize all permanent secretaries and senior government officials here with us today. And among them, I humbly recognize many who were my students, whom I taught one course or another in the course of my career as a law teacher, and some of whom I have encountered in the course of practice before the courts of this republic. Let me recognize one and all and thank you for being here. We recognize members of the media, all of them, and thank them for the work that they do, including the spread of fake news sometimes. I was reading last night on reminding myself on freedom of expression. And I reminded myself that freedom of expression must be defended the most when it hurts, not only when it flatters, because sometimes it flatters only to deceive. So even when it hurts us, we must put our bodies on the line in defense of freedom of expression. It is one of the most important of the fundamental rights that are enshrined in the Constitution. That is why in the constitutional jurisprudence of the United States, it is the most important right and can hardly ever be abridged or restricted. And to all others who are here, including the support staff and security personnel, thank you very much. We appreciate you. We are here today, and I welcome all of you, not just to this event, we have hardly met and interacted except in the rigid or rigidified context of cabinet. That is hardly ever an interaction at all. We haven't laughed, shared jokes as we did before, because we haven't had time to do so. But it is important that from time to time we interact on a light and cheerful note, so that we always constantly remind ourselves that above everything else, we are all human beings. And they say the word human comes from the Latin word humando, which means burial. That we all are in that short trek from womb to tomb. That journey that lies splattered between two legal instruments, the birth and the death certificate. And the question that we must encounter at the end of this journey is, what kind of human beings were we? They say it's a relational question. Who did you help? Who were you useful to? What kind of human being were you? And so we are all wrestling in our individual and collective spaces with this question that examines, that probes, that unsettles, that unhinges, takes us to the very core of who we are, our reason for existence. This retreat, which should have taken place a long time ago, takes place now, and it is but the first phase of an orientation program that will continue, and it will not stop until we reach the end of this journey, when we are lowered into the depths. We have, all of us here, if I may prefigure and frame the discourse, and I start at the personal. And in my battles as a human rights activist, I was taught that the personal is political. So I start with the personal, for all of us. And the personal is the self, yourself, myself. Self, yourself, myself, it denotes a concept of ownership. You own the self, you own yourself, you are in control, you are in charge, or so we assume. We offered ourselves, all of us here. We elected, we made the choice and election to offer ourselves for election. We elected to present ourselves to the electorate as electable, and were thus elected on the representations that we made, on the solemn undertakings and pledges on which we stand and on which we may fall if we are not serious or careful. And by presenting ourselves in this manner, we chose, we elected, each one of us, to locate ourselves in a narrative larger and grander than each and every one of us. You are part of a narrative larger and grander than yourself. You elected when you offered yourself to break out of and liberate yourself from the egocentric predicament. It is now no longer about yourself. It is about yourself in community with other selves. It is a community of selves. And the self is best served and best serves when it is in community with others. And so we are all now servants of the people, emissaries, representatives, outposts, each and every one of us, wherever we are, of this republic. And so I call on all of us today and going forward to appreciate that we must take a stand on two aspects of our situation. Those of you whom I have taught, especially jurisprudence, may recall some of these things. The first aspect of our situation is what I style the issue of context and contextuality. Context and contextuality describes our relation to the habitual settings of our actions. The routinized collective institutions and preconceptions, the personal habits that we've stylized in the form of a character, that in turn defines the self, who we are, or who we believe ourselves to be. It's a constellation of some of these habits which we've picked up over time and climb, some of which we may have to shed, abandon, change, the better for us to die 1,000 deaths every day, every minute, to be reborn a different self, a more radical self, a more transformative self, a self that links with other selves in a bond of shared vision and transformative action. We can limit ourselves by believing, fetishizing our context, taking it as we find it, and striving as best we can to live it as we found it. We would have failed if that's what we have come here to do. We now must face context-smashing thoughts and actions. So we must rise, transcend the predicament of context by, even in relation to ourselves, sometimes you must get out of yourself. You must other yourself. And from that othered perspective, look back at yourself and reflect on your own strengths, your own weaknesses, your own foibles, your own faults and shortcomings. So we need to look at ourselves in this manner and look also at the institutions that we've inherited, the institutions in which we operate, and the institutions over which we have custodianship or stewardship. How do we relate with these habitual settings of our actions? What do we think about the institutions that we find? Because our relation with them may define us as idolaters, may amount to institutional idolatry, where we think these institutions are so sacred, so holy, they cannot be changed, they cannot be improved. So we must get into a context smashing and mashing exercise. And that is part of what we are called upon to do here. So we reflect on our own selves and we reflect on the institutions that bound or bind us. We are bounded. So we must break outside the barriers, the boundaries, and the barricades. That is the question of context and contextuality. In sum and substance, we define ourselves by our attitude towards these settings, the provenance thereof, their origin, their transformability. I doubt, and I hope there's no one here who believes that there is any aspect of the current setting, or any setting for that matter, that is untransformable, that is not liable to redefinition, to rethinking, reconceptualization. And we must agree, we've defined in part, we've mapped out in faint charcoal outline perhaps, the standards by which we ought to assess these institutions and their transformability. We've said, as a broad framework, as a conceptual paradigm, we employ a human rights-based approach. This is an approach that says to us, we are dealing with rights that we did not give. We are not the givers of these rights. Let us make no mistake about this. We have committed ourselves, as I said, to a narrative that is bigger and grander than each and every one of us. And that narrative anchors itself on rights that are not given by us. They are not even given by the Constitution. That's now an ideological leaning on my part. I don't give these rights. The Constitution doesn't give anybody any rights. The Constitution recognizes rights that exist and predate the Constitution itself. If you look at it that way, then you appreciate that the Constitution itself may call for transformation. It is crying out as we speak for transformation. That is why we've said we want to have a comprehensive constitutional review, because we appreciate the strictures, the limitations of the Constitution as it now stands. And we all know that it is a Constitution that gives or recognizes, on the one hand, and claws back, whittles down, reduces, diminishes, emasculates some of these rights that it recognizes. And so part of the reform that we must undergo is to strengthen, so that when we have recognized, we don't then weaken, reduce the potency of what we've recognized. And we must all appreciate this. The second aspect is what I call the aspect of solidarity, the solidaristic. And this speaks to our relations to one another, the unlimited quality of our mutual dependence, that there's fluidity in the resultant domains of our mutual cooperation. Even in the most private and intimate of spaces, we appreciate we need each other. We need each other. We cannot operate without each other. We derive fulfillment from our relations with each other, our mutual dependence. Because we are communal creatures at the end of it all. Because the self, as I said, is best served and best serves when it is in community with others. But this community of a self with other selves presents dangers to the self itself and the other selves that it is in community with. Even in our private estuaries, even as we sometimes profess to love one another, whatever we understand that to mean, we present danger to each other. We tend to think we not only own ourselves, but we own the other selves that we from time to time come into some union with. So much so that when that union fails, some of us seek to enforce this union by force, violently. And we give it a name. We call it gender-based violence. Because the self that remains trapped, hostage of the egocentric predicament, is unable to break free from this frozen crust and appreciate its own limitations and realize that when the relationship is not working, it is not an indictment on that self or any other self for that matter. That we can love and walk away. Very difficult. And as watching the progress of the debate on gender-based violence recently, and I remembered when I stood up in Parliament and questioned, why do we call this gender-based violence? When does it assume the nature and character of gender-based violence? Why not just violence simpliciter? Violence, because that's what defines the society. We are a violent nation. Let us accept this. We are violent, each and every one of us. We need to be honest. That is why I said you must sometimes examine yourself from an otherly point of view. Get out of yourself to examine yourself. If we lock these doors and ask each one of us individually, when did you lay a hand on anybody? The answers may be extremely embarrassing if they are honest enough. It's both ways. We are a violent society. We teach, we reinforce violence. In our schools, we socialize the children into an understanding that order must be exacted through some violent means. When we violently punish the students and we say sparing the rod is spoiling the child, when the weight of evidence suggests that this is exactly what entrenches violence in the psyche of these children, and they develop into problem adolescents, problem adults, violent nation. And when violence erupts in little pockets all over, we get on the moral high horse, those of us who've not been found out, and we condemn from the rooftops, and we forget our own complicity in the scourge. So we are all culpable as a nation, each and every one of us. And so when we single out an individual, a young person, a young professional up and coming, and we scapegoat, we are expressing this violent propensity. That's exactly what we are doing. We are doing what the farmers of old used to do, which gave rise to the word scapegoat. They would take a goat, tie a load, mention all their problems, and tie this. Everybody comes and there's all their failings, all their weaknesses, all their challenges, all their problems. They tie to this helpless goat and they throw it into the desert. And that's the scapegoat. So we are scapegoating a young person. First, because we cannot reconcile ourselves with the fact that even at the level of rhetoric, as we exalt and we extol young people, we are still unwilling to accept them when they take to the front lines. This is the honest truth. We pretend we like young people. We pretend we want them empowered. But that must only exist at the level of rhetoric. It must not translate into concrete action, deliverable in the shape and form of a human being that stands and says, I am the answer. I am that young person. And that is why we unleash so much ire and fire on the young person. She is the scapegoat for our collective faults and shortcomings as a violent nation, one that refuses to take responsibility and accountability for its collective failures. We must reflect on these things and reflect on them honestly. And I'm not in a popularity contest. I don't care for popularity. Principle. That's what counts for me. So that when I've ceased to care or count, principle must continue to speak. And it must speak for us, it must speak for this administration. And so, we are here to wrestle with these realities. At the basic and rudimentary level, when we wrestle with them, we are forced to ask ourselves, whatever we do or try to do, what is the source of the power that we want to exercise? Trace it to some place. And so part of this exercise is to equip you with the knowledge of where the source of the power lies. You need to know, to be able to put your finger on the source, the fons et origo, the source and the origin of the power that you exercise as a minister, as a permanent secretary, as whatever position you hold. And when you are able to locate the source of the power, you can then appreciate the boundary lines, the borderlands of the power that you've been given. And most of the power lies in some legal instrument, some statutory provision. What does it say about what you can or cannot do? So always, and this is where the problem comes, which is why we have a lot of cases in the courts reviewing administrative decisions. Because the litigant is saying, one, this person did not have the power to do what they did. They did not. Here is the law under which they are regulated. So you must know the regulatory framework. What is the statute that regulates you and what you want to do? So they say, you don't have the power. Here's the law. So you've acted outside of it. You've acted ultra vires. That's the first point of attack. Easy. Because the person simply takes what you did, pits it against the statute and says, it's not there. Therefore, you have no power to do it. And you say, but I'm the minister. Yes, you may be minister. I'm the president. Yes, you may be the president. But you don't have the power. Show me where the source of your power is. So that's the first thing we need to appreciate. The second is this. When you've then located the source, you must understand the boundaries of the power. Because if you do not know, not understand the parameters, you will stray outside. And you will be reviewed and your decision set aside. The other part is that when you take all these decisions, you must apply your mind. Don't receive, because the permanent secretary gives it to you. It's not a defense. I signed because the permanent, no. Don't even start. Did you apply your mind? Application of mind. It's a requirement of the law. Failure to apply mind. And it can be demonstrated. So it's an illegal decision, tainted, because you failed to apply your mind. And it bifurcates. It says, either properly or at all. You failed completely, or you did not, you purported, you thought you were, but you were not applying your mind properly. So your decision will be set aside. You took into account irrelevant or extraneous considerations. And when that happens, what they say then is, it shows that this person did not even understand the power. And if they did not understand it, there's no way in which they can claim to have exercised it either properly or at all. So the decision that is impugned then dies off because of some of these. And so this exercise is to equip you with the learnings, the understanding to wrestle with some of these issues. They are not legal as such. They are just plain common sense. So don't confuse yourself. Don't say, but this president says, now I must become a lawyer. No, I'm not saying so. You don't need to be a lawyer. You just need to exercise common sense. And the life of the law, as Oliver Wendell Holmes, that famous American judge, says, the life of the law is not logic. The life of the law is common sense. Does it make sense to you? Does it make sense to anybody? So you can construct your grid reference of logic, but the standard is common sense. Common sense. And so when all else fails, examine the common sense of any decision that you are about to take. And at the end of it all, and this is now about the concept of humility. Humility. Just sometimes as you exit yourself to examine yourself, you must know that you may actually be wrong. Always. There's a residual risk that whatever you think is wrong. Even when you think you are 100% correct, you may actually be wrong. So you must have the hermeneutic humility to appreciate that all these lofty propositions that you proffer are ultimately revisable. They may be established to be wrong. And even the person that you dismiss as having no truth at all may actually have a fragment of the truth. You may have another fragment. You need to bring these fragments together to get a better. The condition of truth is to allow critical intellect to be displayed and enacted. That's the condition of truth. And the condition of hope is to lay the present realities, our context, our contextuality, lay them open for future possibilities. This is a challenge that you now, as you deal with these matters, engage your imagination. Imagination, that aspect of the mind that is neither modular nor formulaic, that has the power to recombine everything with everything else, that advances in insight by examining, challenging its own methods, suppositions, and presuppositions, and that moves in insight by considering the adjacent possibilities, but that is also not shy to venture into the realm of the far removed, the speculative. When we get into that space, we now stray into the prophetic. You can't lead if you're not a prophet. Imagination to the rescue. Thank you so very much. I officially open your training. Thank you.